Hi, listeners. I'm Laura Humm, and I am here with the amazing Wonder Woman, Alicia McCalla, who is going to talk to us a little bit about her new romance, right?
Yes. It definitely is new. It's new to me because I don't usually write romance. And I actually went publicly and said, I will never write a romance. But it's gotten to the point now where I was like, I need to make a little bit more money with my writing. And so I'm trying out something new. So I'm taking my brand of strong Black women and sci-fi fantasy stories, and I'm putting that archetype into romance story. And so my struggles are that I'm generally a pantser and have been for most of my writing career. And it's been a little bit of a struggle for me to learn the dialogue or techniques, because I really want to get to that 70 to 80% of most of my chapters being dialogue. And so I'm certainly able to do the drafting of the dialogue. So I'm able to get phase one down, but now I'm in the phase of self-editing. So edit phase 1 and 2. And so there's a little bit of struggle there with me for getting into editing and understanding how to do it. However, I do want to caveat this with, I really appreciate you and Jeff for creating this system. But I also love you in particular because your techniques for editing have empowered me. And so before, I would just pants out a draft and just spew it out, and then just like, what editor I need to find to do a developmental edit. It's almost like I was not taking any responsibility for my writing. And now it's like, you gotta take responsibility for this bad draft, man, and fix it.
I love that you're feeling empowered by the editing techniques. So I know that writing is a very, very hard art, and finding the right editor who can encourage you and help you like want to write better can be really hard, and it can be really expensive, right? You know, not everybody has the same amount of resources to put into an editor. So it's really important for us at the Dialogue Doctor to help people at whatever stage they are in writing, both from a skill standpoint, but also from a financial standpoint, right? Like we can't all be Stephen King and have that kind of income to, I'm sure he has a team of editors, you know, a developmental editor, a line editor, a copy editor, right? Like, but most of us, I mean, maybe our listeners are at that same income level as Stephen King, and I applaud them for that. But for those of us who don't have those same kind of resources, it's really important for us to be able to know how to ask the right questions about our writing so that we can find places, or ask our beta readers or our friends who are coming in along the way to help us, like, what should I be looking for? Where are the places that my story can use a push, either from adding more dialogue or reducing some of the reader burden or whatever else that we're seeing as writers? But if we don't know how to ask for the type of help we need, it's hard to know, you know, like you can give something to somebody and they can be like, yeah, it's good. But if they don't know what they're looking for, they're not really going to be able to help you. So I am glad we empowered you to do this. I know that
it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt though, because it kind of hurts.
I was just going to say, I know how uncomfortable this was for you. So I'm so excited that you're trying it.
Yes. And the chapter that I sent you was, so I've never written from a male's perspective. So I had to write from the hero's perspective in this. So I feel like there's a lot of learning going on for me. One, I'm writing romance, which is very different. And so I'm at this point too, where the hero is like, I want to see some violence, more violence here. And it's like, I can't write I could, but you know, I have to figure out how to do this in the right way. So I'm very curious to know, well, what questions do you have? So the draft that I sent you, I went through edit phase 1 and edit phase 2 on it. Okay. So this would have been my version of trying to get it out. And I know that my word counts were out And I know that I probably had some more places to relieve that reader burden. So
Excellent. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to share the screen. And while I do that, why don't you tell listeners a little bit about what's happening in this chapter?
Okay. So basically, I finished chapter 1, and my main character was, or my heroine was being attacked by her supervisor. And I found a way to put a missile in there, right? So it goes right into the hero's perspective. And this is the first time that we actually meet him. And so it goes from him, he's an alien and he's an alien prince, but he has this amnesia, technical amnesia, that he was put under upon coming to Earth to hide himself on Earth. And so the first part of this is all about us all about showing him and his coming back from amnesia and trying to find his ship because he knows that something is wrong.
Excellent. So I am super excited about this story. I'm excited about everything you write, but I'm really excited about this story because it's a new genre for you, right? But you're not taking the typical romance tropes. You're putting your brand into those tropes. And I love that. I love when a writer can stay true to themselves when they switch genres. I think something to be applauded. And I think you're doing a really great job with it. I know in the earlier part because we did a session, you and Jeff and me did a session after a conference about finding these voices. And you were really kind of struggling with this idea of like, how do I take my brand and create this romance story between it? And when I got to the end of this chapter and the male protagonist meets the female protagonist for the first time, I was really excited about the way that romance kind of has the potential to spark there, because that was something that I remember in our session, you were worried about, like, how do we make this work? So I was really excited to see this chapter and work on this chapter with you. So we talked before this session, and just so kind of to bring the listeners into kind of where we are, we agreed that rather than me doing the traditional edit and just walking you through my edits, we were going to do this a little differently. And I was going to help you identify places where you can do your own edit. So for those of you who are listening at home, you can kind of take these same kind of questions that I'm helping Alicia think of on her own and kind of apply them to your own work. Because the goal is for you as the writer to be empowered to do as much of your editing as you feel comfortable with, or unfortunately can afford at some points. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, is my screen zoomed in enough? Do you want a little bit bigger font?
Good.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so the scene, so just so you know, what I would do as an editor here is I read the scene for the first time, just start to finish, as if I'm a reader reading it for the first time, which is going to be a little different for me as an editor than it is going to be for you as the writer, because you as the writer know the story, you know where it fits, you know where you need it to go. So that's going to be a little bit harder for you, but I definitely encourage you when you're editing to really, and anyone who's in the Dialogue Doctor Slack group, every editing prompt starts with read your piece, right? Like, and I always mean read it as a reader, not read it as a writer, and really not even read it as an editor, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to connect with the story. You're trying to feel what the reader's feeling. You're trying to figure out where the reader is going to have questions. And if you have any part of your writer hat on, you're going to get to something where your reader has a question, but you as the author already know the answer to it. So you're going to skip over it. Okay, so I would go ahead and I would read it out loud one time, or out loud to myself. I don't always read it out loud. Sometimes though, I will use the editing programs, like the Word has it, my iPad has it, the screen read aloud. So it's being read to me, because I feel like that you hear it differently than if you're reading it. So that might be a trick for a writer who is struggling to take themselves out of the writing mode to listen to it instead of reading it. So sorry, got a little distracted there. So I would read it once all the way through. And then I would take a step back and I would say, okay, how did that feel to me? Were there places where I was confused? Were there places where I felt really connected? Were there places where I wanted to feel connected, but I didn't really feel connected? And then I would kind of make a mental note to myself that, you know, these are places that we can clean up. The more time you spend with this process, similar to the stage 1, stage 2, writing, editing process, you're going to merge those together. So when I say I read it once all the way through, I'm actually thinking about these things while I'm reading, because I've trained myself over the years to be able to do the two things at once. But for the beginning part of this, really read it, get into the perspective of reading it as a reader, and then ask yourselves those questions at the end. Where was I confused? Where did I want to connect? Where did I feel a lot of emotion? Where didn't I feel a lot of emotion? Because those are really going to be your key points in doing a dialogue-centric editing, because those are the places where your readers are connecting, emotion and dialogue. Right. We talk about that all the time. Okay. So as I was reading this, actually, before I tell you where I saw places that I would fix, I'm guessing that you had the opportunity to read this.
Yes.
Okay. Great.
You want to just start with paragraph 1?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So when I originally read it, so all I had when I first started was just the dialogue. And so one of the things that happens to me is I look at it and go, oh, so I feel like the first sentence was in the dialogue was "Wake up, Your Highness," right? And so I felt like I had that piece of dialogue, but I knew that people didn't really understand where is that. So I tried to set the scene, you know, as much as I could, so that somebody coming into it at least would understand who is the guardian? What is that? But I am doing alien superhero romance. So my assumption, I did make some assumptions about the reader. Whoever's coming to this, 1, they understand science fiction. 2, they like aliens, so they get that part. They in this chapter 2. So I made a lot of assumptions. I don't know. Maybe they didn't work. So
okay. So your goal for your first paragraph was to set the stage, but also to grab the reader. Okay. Yes. So I'm going to make a note of that this was your goal here. Okay. Then we'll do goals first, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about editing. Okay. So that was your first part. What about your next part? What were you trying for there?
So the next part, I knew that my hero was going to be waking up from this amnesia state. And so I know there's some emotions in there. So I also realized, though, if he's waking up from an amnesia state, well, what does that mean for him? Like, how does that feel for him? So I was trying to add in then the touch, sense, smells of what it meant to be waking up from his version of amnesia, right?
Okay. Excellent.
The next paragraph that I had there, I knew that it's alien, but it's also superhero. And so I showed the reader that he was alien, but I also had to then show him that he was superhero. So then he had his that was a superhero place of putting his suit, because you can't be a superhero if you don't have a suit.
That's right. Okay.
And then it's just the part of him waking up, getting used to his abilities, and trying to save the mothership.
Okay.
So maybe at that point, the conflict starts to come in.
Okay. It also felt to me like in this section, you were trying to give the backstory in this section here.
Some of it was definitely some backstory in there.
Okay.
And I actually went and took some backstory out because I said that's too much for somebody to have right there. So I was trying to find the happy medium between the two.
Excellent. Excellent. So what I felt in here is, as I was reading this section, I was like, okay, this is the perfect opportunity, because your hero is going from Earth to an alien planet. There's time. There's an opportunity there to explain these things to pass the time. So I thought the technique that you used here was really smart. Okay, so then we get to the place where we get, I'm going to scroll through because a lot of this is that movement piece.
Yes.
Okay.
So there is a part where he finally goes to it's probably further down.
Okay.
Well, there is a part. So you said that celestial mate sentence. So that's where I dropped in the romance part.
Right.
It was up just right there. Your celestial mate is in trouble. So that was the romance.
Okay.
And then more conflict. There we go. So my stomach, so that's all backstory.
Okay, so this is more backstory.
About the world and the Dwayne versus the Krava, what happened to his world, that kind of thing.
Perfect.
And then keep going. Okay, so down where I swoop down in front of the secure hanger.
I'm just going to real quick before you do that one, I'm going to make this note here in this section that this is him learning what he's getting into.
Yes.
Because you want both. This is also the moment where you're connecting your chapter 2 to your chapter 1. Okay. Sorry, keep going. You were talking about.
And then I swoop down in front of the secure hanger. So that's when you actually, I want to think that is the true conflict for this chapter, right?
Okay.
So that's when he actually starts engaging with, a person.
Okay. And this is where, is he engaging with the enemy here, or is he engaging with?
So he's going into the enemy's den at that point.
Okay.
And let's see. So he passes through the hangar doors. So at some point, there are things in what I read 35 different like romance insta-loves. And the one thing is, especially in those paranormal insta-loves, is you have this instant attraction or that instant, so like she illuminated with the nanorobotics and her blood. So that's how he knew that was his mate. So I'm thinking that's that romance connection. I barely heard. Let's see, Your Highness. Okay. So this right here, fire in the hole, that's where we pick up exactly then where we left the heroine.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, I use super flight. Okay, so then we just move into his actions.
Mm-hmm.
He's fighting. Okay, so I turn back, lifting her to stand now facing me. So, you know, one of the things that I had to work with for me is, so usually the fight scene is all it's about for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew that I was writing a romance. So this scene is really about the first kiss, right?
Okay, so I'll type first physical connection here.
Yes.
And then that's leading, though there's one other thing that the listeners should understand is that when he is lifting her and pulling her towards him, he makes a decision to switch the shield in his suit to protect her rather than herself. Excuse me, rather than himself. So this is, we'll call that the selfless act.
Mm-hmm. Or the gestures or whatever.
Okay.
And so then they kiss. Okay. So the first kiss is in there. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And then, you know, because it's me, he gets shot.
Well, and you know, how can you have a story without the beginning part of, right? Because otherwise it would just be he saves her, they kiss, they fall in love, and then they save the world. Yeah, he has to get hurt. Okay. So then he gets hurt. Yes. All right. So, ooh, not that. Okay, so here's what you were able to just do for us. You were able to go through the beats of everything that happened plot-wise in your chapter. What I want you to focus on the next time you do this activity is, what feelings do you want your reader to have, rather than what elements do you want them to think about, right? Because we're setting the stage, we're engaging the reader. We want them to understand that he's in pain. We want them to understand he's a superhero. We want them to know that there's some backstory here, right? These are all cognitive things. That makes a great story, right? This is why people come back time and time again to a writer that they love, is because the writer can craft a great story. But what you want to do here is not just craft a great story. You want to create an emotional experience for your readers. So I'm going to take all of these goals and I'm going to turn them around and I'm going to make them emotion. Okay. So this goal of setting the stage and engaging the reader, you want the reader to feel surprise. Right? Mm-hmm. Then when he's in pain, you want them to feel maybe confusion, maybe a little bit of worry. Okay. Then when we get to this alien versus superhero, you want them to have this kind of aha moment. Now I get what's happening here, right? Mm-hmm. Now, in this place where you're showing conflict and you're explaining backstory, you want them to be engaging in your story. So you want them to be connecting with what's happening. But you also want to make sure that this is relieving any confusion. And you're also moving places, right? So there needs to be something to help us understand the passage of time. You're going from Earth to an alien location. presumably that's going to take quite a bit of time. So we also want to.
So they actually are on Earth.
Oh, they are on Earth.
Yes.
Oh, that was confusing to me then. Okay.
So we need to fix that, right?
Right. So in chapter 1, so he's in Atlanta.
Uh-huh.
I thought she was on a hangar and her friend was in DC.
Yeah, so they're all on Earth. Nobody's at a different planet at all.
Well, how did I get that?
I don't know.
Different story. Maybe because he revealed himself as an alien, I assumed she was on a different, maybe that's planet. Just poor reader assumption on my part. Okay, so where is she? Where are they located?
So she is in a secret hangar. And I never really actually said where she was. I know her friend was in DC, but I purposely didn't say because I just wanted it to be that she was in a maximum security hangar. So maybe I need to go back in chapter 1 and put where she's located.
So I think what threw me off was when they were talking about what time it was. It's 1 a.m. where you are. Mm-hmm. I was comparing that to DC. I was assuming it was regular working hours in DC. So then I was assuming it was like ahead by lots of hours. Mm-hmm. And then there was an alien hangar. So then I assumed they weren't on Earth. So poor assumption on my part as a reader, but just something to think about. Okay, but even still, he's moving. He doesn't really know where he's going, right? He's just following the beacon.
Yes.
Okay, so there is still a place and time moment. We need to understand the passage of time and space. So he's leaving Atlanta. He's going somewhere where it's 1 a.m. while it's Atlanta's
1 a.m.
Oh, it's 1 a.m. in Atlanta as well.
Yeah, so I kind of think maybe, so here's where that pantsing gets in the way. I didn't want to exactly describe where she was because I thought, well, is she in Atlanta or is she in DC?
Okay, so not far.
Yes, I was trying to make him not be too far from her. So my assumption that she was in a secure hangar in Atlanta, but kind of who does that?
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'll make a choice.
There are lots of secure hangars, lots of places.
Yeah, so she's in a secure place in Atlanta. Let's just say it like that. That'll make it easier.
Okay. So, but he still has to get to her. So that's another thing that you want to think about is how close is he to her? Because you have all of this space of all of this description and backstory. If he only has to go 5 miles and he has super speed and he's flying there, do you have enough time to have all of this conversation? Mm-hmm. Maybe, maybe not. Okay. So now we understand. Now what we've come up with here is that there's a little bit of reader burden here that we need to clean up. Being a pantser, being a plotter doesn't actually matter. You're going to create reader burden somewhere in your story because you know the whole story. Readers are going to read something different than what you know. So it's going to happen. It's just a matter of knowing that it's going to happen and then kind of backing it out. Sorry, my dog is chewing on a bone behind me. I hope it's not distracting. Okay, so when you introduce this romance element, the fact that there's this celestial mate, we want this, again, we want readers to feel something, right? So up here, we're like feeling a little bit of, I didn't actually put the emotion. We're connecting to what's happening. We want them to start building the excitement here, right? Mm-hmm. We're about to go on a journey with a superhero. We want to feel that with them, but at the same time, we want to hold that. We want to creep it up slowly. I like to think of this part as like you're about to go on a roller coaster and you get strapped in and it starts clicking up that first hill and it's like click, click, click. And that anticipation starts at first, and then it builds and it builds and it builds. And as you get to the top of that hill, that's when you take that really deep breath. That's what happens here when you introduce the idea of romance. You're not just saving your city, whatever, you're saving your soulmate. So this is that like top of the roller coaster. You want your readers to go and really hold on and lean in here, right? So this is like an exciting reveal. This is the part where the kids are screaming, the dryer's buzzing, the timer's going off for dinner, and we're ignoring it all because we're going to finish this chapter, right?
Yes.
We got to meet his soulmate. All right. So then we get back into the more backstory. Here, this is a great place to put more backstory because this draws out that excitement, right? We just found out 3 chapters ago that he's got a soulmate. And now we're not talking about a soulmate anymore. We're talking about why he's on this, why he's hiding on Earth. And like, right, like we're hearing all this backstory. We're like, but I want to know about his love, right? Like his soulmate. So like, this is a really great place to pull out that intensity, right? So you're building the anticipation. Okay. And then we get this moment where he's entering the chapter 1 story, but we're not saying necessarily exactly that it's her yet. We don't want them to really make the full connection until we hear the bad guy say fire in the hole, right? Like that's the place where we want it to be clear. Here, we want them to have an inkling of like, wait, do I know what's going on here? Right? Like this moment of like, what? Wait, what? So I'm just going to use my really articulate language skills and go, wait, what? Because that's what we want the reader to feel, right? And you'll notice as I'm going through, I'm not really looking at the details of the story. I'm only focusing on the emotions. The reason why I'm tying them to your plot points is because when you're dropping a new plot point, that's the place where you want to change or accelerate what the reader is feeling. Because once you know that, you can then go back, and I'm not going to do quite the rest of them because I want to go back and I want to take a look, because we want to go and we want to compare what we're reading on the page to what we're feeling in that moment, because that's where we're going to make some edits to change things around. So any questions before we take one of those spaces?
No, I'm good.
Okay, great. This is likely the first time you or one of our other listeners does this. It's going to feel really weird to not think about plot, but to only think about emotion, right? Because as writers, we're taught, tell a good story, organize your story, make sure you're revealing information in a way that's like captivating to your audience. And we think about it all from the cerebral perspective, all about from the brain. We have to organize and we have to plan and we have to plot. Even if we're pantsers, we have to make sure that our story lines up. But the reader doesn't really care about that. They just care about how the book makes them feel, how the story makes them feel. So when we're editing, if we can put that kind of intellectual side of our brain to the side and really just flip that switch to our emotional state, it'll really help us look at what's happening on the page so much more easily, right? Okay, so in this first paragraph, we start with a jolt shook me awake in my Atlanta high-rise apartment. Fantastic. That brings the surprise, right? That's exciting. Then we have, it felt like I'd been bludgeoned by a sledgehammer. Grabbing my head, I knew something was very wrong. As my alien brain awakened to the frequency of the mothership, the suppressed memories flooded back like an oppressive wave. The Guardian's artificial intelligence voice was low, and it was hard to interpret the signal. Then the volume increased, but was muffled. Wake up, Your Highness, right? That's exciting. There's a lot of information there, though, right?
It is, yes.
And you get to the very end, and this is where you have your dialogue. And you said that your first instinct was to put wake up, Your Highness first, And then you went and you added all of this prose. But if you've got a reader who is really just focused on the emotional intensity, they may read a jolt shook me awake and then wake up your highness. And they might miss all of this in here, right? So maybe what you can do is this conversation between the AI and your hero can be a little bit more, right? So maybe what you do is you take up, you put a jolt shook me awake in my Atlanta high-rise apartment. Wake up your highness. It felt like I was being bludgeoned by a sledgehammer. And then he says something else, your highness, right? Like, and he keeps repeating the same thing. So you keep having this touch point where it's like, my alien brain was awakened. Wait, he's an alien? What's happening here, right? Like this shock and surprise can remain at the forefront because you're giving the reader something new to be like confused by in every paragraph instead of lumping it into one paragraph.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm interpreting what you're saying. Yep. So you're saying everything that I put in this paragraph could almost be switched around into dialogue. Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. Yep. So you want to see how it could look?
Yes.
Okay. So let me figure out how to turn on the track changes mode. Okay. So a jolt shook me awake in my Atlanta high-rise apartment. Wake up, your highness. I felt bludgeoned by the sledgehammer. Now, your highness.
Oh.
Grabbing my head, I knew something was very wrong. Turn on your alien brain already. Right? So now, and this part of this, I'm going to take a quick aside from here. You have to figure out how this AI speaks. If this AI speaks like a human, having him say something like turn on your alien brain already works really well. If you want this AI to be much more artificial, then you want the language to be much more like programmed, right?
So the AI in my story, I decided was a robotic parent. So it can get very pontificating and long-winded as well.
Great. Okay. So then you want to think about this AI as being like maybe a parent waking up a child who is late for work, right? So maybe it's that first, wake up, your highness. Now, your highness, get your ass out of bed, your highness, right? Like, kind of that. If you like kind of, and so this is what I typically do as an editor, just as, because we're talking about tips and tricks. Once you figure out that the surprise isn't coming through enough, it doesn't have the same punch to do this with this like surprise into confusion and worry and orienting the reader to the story, you can think about this as, okay, give me a situation that I've experienced, either as the person waking someone up from a cold sleep or the person being woken up out of, maybe I'm in a really great dream and all of a sudden the alarm's going off or the dog's barking or whatever it is. Like, put yourself in that moment and focus on those feelings, right? Like, and maybe instead of just going, it felt like I was being bludgeoned by a sledgehammer, maybe it's, what? And then maybe he says, what does he call his AI?
Usually guardian.
Okay. So maybe he goes, guardian, is that you? Because presumably if he's been in a hybrid state, he hasn't heard from the guardian in a while, right?
Yes.
Okay. This changes now what's happening. Now I'm feeling his fear. I'm feeling his confusion, as opposed to being told before, I was awakened by this frequency of the mothership. I was suppressing memories, right? This artificial intelligence was low and hard to interpret, right? Maybe if you add the low and hard to interpret the signal up here, I felt like I was being bludgeoned by a sledgehammer, and the voice was low and hard to interpret. Maybe we don't put the signal there. So you're taking that same information that you were creating as the writer to explain the experience, and you're putting us as the reader in that moment. This is what we talk about when we say show, don't tell. The original paragraph was great. It was telling us everything we needed to know, but it was telling us that we should be surprised, versus what we have changed it to. A jolt shook me awake in my Atlanta high rise. Wake up, Your Highness. What? I felt like I had been bludgeoned by the sledgehammer. The voice was low and hard to interpret. Now, Your Highness. Guardian? I'm actually now going to move this. Grabbing my head. Is that you? Right? Now I'm feeling what he's feeling. I'm feeling that pain you were trying to get me to think about, but now you're making me feel it. But notice there's only one thing that I added that wasn't already there. And that's like this one right here, right? Where he's talking back to the guardian. Otherwise, everything else was in your paragraph already. I just moved it around and punctuated it with dialogue. Okay, so how do you then take this and do this on your own if I'm not sitting with you, right? Because that's the big question.
Yeah, because I'm sitting there going, I have no idea.
Right. So this is one of these things where, you know, I've done this many, many, many times before. So hopefully it looks easy when I do it. Otherwise, I need to find a different career, right? Because
one of the things I do want to note from looking at this is, so when I finished my second phase, I was just trying to get it all out and make it clear. And so I think that, you know, maybe taking a couple of weeks away and now we're looking at it again, I don't know, maybe I need a 3 so that I find the places where I have those big chunks and just start breaking those down into dialogue, I think.
Yeah. So there are a couple things you can take away from this. So where this becomes part of your process, this can be interjected in a couple of different places. So in your very first draft, you probably had wake up, Your Highness, ouch, and then hurry, Your Highness, right? That was probably your first draft. When you went from draft 1 to draft 2 and you looked at wake up, Your Highness, ouch, hurry, Your Highness, you said, because remember, when you go from draft 1 to draft 2, you're tracking for places that you're creating reader burden and you want to build back, you want to like pull back the reader burden. Right. And your gut instinct to clarify that reader burden was to put content in prose, where I want to encourage you to focus your energy is, instead of trying to relieve reader burden with prose, try to relieve reader burden with dialogue. Right? So notice what we did here. Instead of going wake up, Your Highness, ouch, we went wake up, Your Highness, what? Now, Your Highness, guardian, is that you? Right? Like, so I took the same thing you were trying to do to relieve that reader burden, but I put it in their mouth instead of putting it in prose, which is a little bit weird to say because you are writing first person here. So it does feel like often when you're writing first person that when you're putting it in the prose, you're actually putting it in their mouth because it's first person, but it feels very different to the reader to see it in quotation marks than it does seeing it in a paragraph of prose.
Right.
So to go back to it, one, thinking about the emotion you want as you're doing your very first dialogue only draft, to think about like, what is happening in this moment? What are these people speaking here? You can try to put more dialogue there. Then when you're seeing that there's reader burden and you're going from 1 to 2, trying to focus on dialogue and breaking up prose when you're writing it. The other thing that I just want to make sure that I'm reminding you and our listeners is that the goal at the end of a dialogue-centric writing session, whether you're combining 1 and 2 together, or if you're really doing draft 1 and then draft 2, the idea isn't when you're finished that you don't ever have to edit again. Right? The idea is that now you have a dialogue-centric scene that you can manipulate the emotion of. So the only thing that we did here, Alicia, was we took this paragraph that was setting the stage and engaging the reader. It was doing that, but what it wasn't doing was it wasn't making me as a reader feel surprised. Right. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to take what was there that was engaging and setting the stage and make me feel something. Now I feel it because I have the dialogue, I have the body language, I have this, like, you have this great moment where he holds on to his head, right? Like, how many readers read that and don't like put a hand to their head to be like, oh, right? Like, that's what we do. That's empathy, right? So that's all we're trying to do, is we're trying to take those moments where there's great opportunity for emotional connection, and we're rising them to the surface by creating a back and forth that allows us to feel something rather than to think something.
Gotcha.
Because when I read it the first time, I thought, oh, I should be surprised here, right? I didn't feel the surprise that we want somebody to feel, right? If I'm reading a paragraph and the phone rings and I'm thinking that I should be surprised here and the phone rings, I'm like, oh, there's the phone. Yeah. And if I'm feeling surprised and the phone rings, I'm like, forget that, I'm here. And, and right? That's what we want. We want to create that experience to pull people into the moment. Okay.
So this next part where you have, where we took all the other stuff. So does all of that go then about the volume increasing and all? So that's just out of there now.
I mean, so we did this really fast. You have a lot of good details in here that if we were spending time on this, I feel like some of that is really great that we want to work into this section up here. So this volume increasing, right? Maybe we put this in. So now, Your Highness, the volume increased, but was still muffled. Right? So it's the same stuff you have, we're just punctuating it with dialogue. The other thing we're doing is we're tricking the reader by making a new paragraph. When you make a new paragraph, your reader automatically pays more attention to what's happening. Right? So think about yourself when you're reading, especially like when you're reading maybe in like a textbook or something, right? Like we're taught as children that the most important stuff that happens in a paragraph happens at the very first sentence and the very last sentence. Everything else in the middle is just supportive material.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So we take that with us as adults as we're reading. So when you're writing your paragraph of prose, your readers, especially when they're taught about like how to speed read and how to get the information that they need when they're in like the 7th and 8th grade, moving into high school, about to have to learn to take on their education differently, they're learning some of these tips and techniques about how to get information out of intellectual books that they're then taking with them into their fun reading. And we don't even always know it. I always say that that's a lazy reader, but it's actually a technique that you're taught in school about how do you get the information as quickly as possible, especially if you're doing research, right? Like if you're doing research and you have a whole book that you're trying to reference for a 3-page paper, maybe you don't have to read the whole book. Maybe you read the chapter headings, find the chapter you want to read that or one section of that. That's not what you want your fiction writers doing, your fiction readers doing. You want your fiction readers reading everything on the page. Gotcha. So trick them by breaking it up into really small paragraphs. By the way, this also works if you're sending an email to a really busy person. Trick them by making really small paragraphs.
I got it.
It draws the attention in.
So at this moment, my brain is currently thinking I need a phase 3, like a 2 to 3, where I go back and it's about making any big paragraphs smaller. I think that might be helpful to me as a technique.
Yep.
And turning the big paragraphs into dialogue runs instead of drops of information or something.
Yep, absolutely. The other place that you can do it is right now you're taking 1 to 2. And when you go from 1 to 2, you're writing a big paragraph. Before you leave that big paragraph, or even ideally, like as you catch yourself writing a big paragraph, stop yourself and go, wait a minute. What can I do differently with this in this moment? Instead of writing a paragraph, can I do it in dialogue? If it's better for you to use the process you have and tack it on at the end, do what you're saying and go back and look at it and go, okay, so, because, I would say down here, we're explaining the
concept. So I think I naturally do. So I think my natural inclination is to chunk it all in there. So I think, but then if I'm going from phase 1 to phase 2, and then if phase 2 to 3 is okay, now you go back and look to see where are all those chunks that you just dropped in, because I think I'm a dumping kind of a person, right?
Perfect.
So then, and I'll go, oh, that is, maybe I need to go, that's more than a good paragraph, or there's no spacing in there. Go back and fix that to make that dialogue. I think I can understand that part.
Okay, then do it that way. Go write what feels natural, dump it out, and then go back and edit. And I would say do that like 3 or 4 times. And then like on your 5th time, as you're doing the second draft, start catching yourself like after Faster. You've done it enough times and you're like, oh, I wrote this whole paragraph. Now I got to break it up. Oh, I wrote this whole paragraph. Now I got to break it up. Hopefully what'll happen is you'll start catching yourself as you write it. So like, as you're writing this, I grunted to the mothership guardian. There was a good reason I decided that my royal siblings were placed in cold storage, right? Like this is really important. But if I'm just reading for dialogue, I'm going to read this and I'm going to read this and I'm going to miss the fact that he's in cold storage, but he's talking to somebody. So I'm moving quickly to locate your position. Maybe this is a place where the AI says, maybe, I don't know, again, depending on what your AI is, you said your AI is kind of like a parent. So I feel like a parent who's waking their kid up because they're late for work, like wakes them up and is like, okay, now that you're up and you're moving, how are you feeling? Do you want some lunch? Right? Like,
yeah. So that's where I was intending to go with this AI, because I wanted it to be sort of funny-ish, but not necessarily. But you're right. Yes, I probably would like it to say something like that.
Okay. So if we do something like that, maybe it's like, should I wake the others or your siblings? This is why I'm not a writer. I can't spell or type, right? And then he can say, just shout no, right?
Yes.
I was struck by, I don't know, whatever you're struck by, the stupidity of the question or whatever, by putting them in harm's way, whatever, you're the writer, you put something here. we put them in cold amnesia on Earth for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
But I couldn't remember any of that at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's the same thing that you did. We're just making it a conversation instead of me being internal talking to myself. Because now I have this moment of connection, because now as a reader, like, I'm building excitement. Hurry, Your Highness. I'm moving as fast as I can. Should I wake your siblings? Wait, there are others who are like him. Are they superheroes? Do they have superpower? Right? Like, now I'm even more excited about the story than I was before, of this, like, we made the decision to put them into cold storage, but I can't remember any of that right now. Right? Like, that's a good story, but it doesn't have the same emotional intensity when you put it in somebody's mouth. So
Gotcha.
Yeah, I have a feeling, just seeing how quickly you adapted to this 1-2 writing style, I have a feeling that after you do 1, 2, 3, you're quickly going to put 2 and 3 together, and you're going to get tired of writing something and pulling it back and writing something and pulling it back.
Right.
I feel like that's the efficiency.
I already struggle with 1 and 2. I was like, what? Why I gotta do it like this? I just want to avoid it.
Well, and okay, so
and I'm generally not an avoider, so it's kind of weird for me.
Okay, so let's be really honest and have some truth here for a moment, right? I think part of the reason why you are writing in this style is because there's, like, when you're writing 1 and then you're going to 2, it's like, this feels like an extra step when I could be doing it at the same time. Because right now, what comes out of 2 looks still a lot like what came out of 1 before you started doing this new technique. So I think by adding this new section that we're doing now, where we take a big paragraph of prose and we break it down, is going to help you feel more empowered in 1 to focus on dialogue. Because if you're thinking about all the details you want to come out, and you're thinking about, how can we talk about this, right? Like, this idea that there is a mate, right? Like a celestial mate out there. And you're thinking about that when you're doing the first draft of dialogue. Things are out of control. It's imperative you get here right now. Your mate's in danger, right? Like, this is a big paragraph, right? If you take, it's all in quotation marks, but it's still really big, right? But if we take this and we go, you're out of control, it's imperative you get here right now. And then he says, I'm moving as fast as I can. And then maybe this is something you explained, because remember we said we needed to understand that distance of time, right? Maybe you're using points in Atlanta. I'm moving as fast as I can. I just passed, I know nothing about Atlanta geography, just so you know, the state building or whatever. Coca-Cola is in Atlanta.
Yeah, Georgia State Capitol. Everybody knows that. Okay. For me, though, I would probably put, I just passed Auburn research area, Sweet Auburn area. Because I usually do, like, historically Black things.
Perfect. And this is, oh, goodness. Okay, there it is. I figured out how to spell that. Right? Like, but whatever it is, what that's doing is it's clarifying to us that there's a passage in time, right? There's a passage in space. You don't have to tell us that now, because they're telling each other, right? Presumably the AI is tracking him already, but think about it. If you're on the phone with somebody and they're like, you're late, you got to get here, what are you going to tell them? Well, I just passed this thing. I'm getting closer. I can't go any faster, right? Like, there's a cop there or whatever, so, like, just using those techniques. But if you can start thinking about these techniques in your draft 1, before you start thinking about, like, all the details of, like, how do I take the dialogue and put the other stuff into it? If you think about what's the stuff I want in my chapter, and think about how can I put that in my characters' voices. If you do that from the beginning, then draft 2 becomes a little bit easier.
Gotcha.
So, but that's going to take some time because you have to get used to finding ways of putting what's traditionally prose in your stories into dialogue, using the process that you're currently using, which is the main points in dialogue, moving it to prose, and then moving prose into your third draft to take the prose and break it out. Once you get a hang of that, by the time you get to chapter 10 or something, you're going to be like, oh, I know I want this to happen in the chapter. I'm just going to make him say it. Now, sometimes what ends up happening is your characters start talking about boring nonsense stuff in your dialogue. And when you go from 1 to 2, you realize that there are maybe 15 exchanges of dialogue that are kind of boring. Then you can take those and you can collapse them into prose. And then you have one paragraph amongst all of these other dialogue, paragraph, paragraph, right? Instead of paragraph, dialogue, paragraph.
Gotcha.
It just changes the reader's experience because we've all felt, I'm moving as fast as I can. I just passed the Auburn exit, right? I've just passed the Auburn area. I know that I'm going where I'm going. I know how long it's going to take me. I know what that feels like when somebody says that. My anxiety already goes up when someone is trying to rush me and I'm trying to explain to them where I am and they're telling me to get there faster. I mean, who hasn't experienced that in their life?
Right. Yeah, it's understandable. I think that there's a part of me too that when you're in a creative process, you're kind of looking for the words. And so I think as I was going through this, I wasn't looking at setting, like, so we all know that you should put setting in dialogue, right? Or locations in dialogue, but I don't think I was thinking about it there. So it's good to bring that out. So I know, okay, here's a place where you could put where you're actually located and put it in the person's mouth. Yep. So I feel like I'm starting to understand even more how to dig deeper into adding that dialogue in.
Yep. And, just for the sake of everybody kind of hearing this, just as a way of just reassuring, first draft versus edited draft. Writing is hard. In comparison, editing is easy, right? Like I can look at something that you have created and I can go, okay, we can elevate the emotion by putting this in their mouth. I'm not creating anything. I'm not doing anything exciting. All I'm doing is taking your story and putting a person in there who is a very verbal, very vocal person. That's all I'm doing. Once you get the hang of that, it becomes really easy in comparison to what you do as a writer. And that's what I think that you adding this as step 3 to the process, because the way your process already works is dialogue, prose, edit. Find the place in your path, because you really don't want to get frustrated with something like editing. Because when you get frustrated with editing, you do what you were saying in the beginning, which was like, I don't take responsibility for my editing. I use my editing partner to take responsibility for my editing. And that works. Like if that's the kind of writer that works best for you and the writing that works best for you, do it, right? But if you're at that place where you want more autonomy over your work, or you're at that place as a writer where you want to use an editor, but you don't have the resources or the time, because sometimes timeline, right? Like sometimes we just got to chunk these things out. These are just tools and techniques that you can use to apply to your own writing, just to push yourself a little bit more. But as far as writing versus editing goes, I'm going to be an editor forever because I cannot do what you writers do. I can't do it.
You could, if you could try.
I could, but I don't like to try things I know I'm not going to be good at. I like to stick in the areas where I know how to be successful. So, all right, before we wrap up, is there anything else you wanted to know or you wanted to see?
I think this was actually, I learned a lot from this.
Fantastic. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and turn the recording off.
Okay.
If I can figure out how to do that. I have to always stop share first.